Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. Emma and Kyle stood at the edge of their campsite, gazing out at the vast expanse of the Appalachian Trail. The golden hues of sunrise filtered through the dense canopy above, painting the forest floor in streaks of light and shadow. For Emma, a nature photographer, the scene was perfection. For Kyle, an avid outdoorsman, it was freedom. "This is the kind of day that makes it all worth it," Emma said, adjusting her camera strap. Kyle nodded, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Trail map, water, snacks, and our trusty legs. What could go wrong? The plan was simple. A day hike along a looped trail that would bring them back to camp by mid-afternoon. They'd leave their tent, gear, and campfire ring behind for a few hours to explore the deeper parts of the forest. Kyle carried a revolver, a precaution against bears or other wildlife, though he'd never had to use it. The trail was stunning, weaving through towering trees, past glistening streams, and over moss-covered boulders. Emma frequently stopped to snap photos, each shutter click capturing the untouched beauty of the wilderness. The couple laughed and talked, their voices the only sounds breaking the serene stillness. As they walked, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The birdsong faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Kyle noticed the shift first, though he didn't mention it. Emma was engrossed in framing a photo of an old, gnarled tree whose bark twisted into almost human-like shapes. "Check this out," she said, beckoning him over. Kyle stepped closer, examining the deep grooves in the bark. The patterns looked intentional, almost like runes or symbols. "Probably just weathering," he said, though something about it unsettled him. "Let's keep moving. We've got a loop to finish." As they continued, the trail seemed to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining above like skeletal fingers. Emma glanced back, her smile faltering. The path behind them looked different. She shook off the feeling, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. Kyle, ever the pragmatist, took mental notes of their surroundings. The landmark he'd been counting on, a massive boulder covered in ivy, was nowhere in sight, despite it being a central marker on the map. He stopped, frowning. "This doesn't feel right," he admitted. "We should have hit the boulder by now." Emma pulled out her phone to check the GPS, but the screen showed nothing but a spinning loading icon. "No signal," she said. Kyle's jaw tightened. "It's fine. We probably just missed the turn. We'll backtrack." But as they retraced their steps, nothing looked familiar. The gnarled tree Emma had photographed was gone, replaced by a cluster of identical pines. The forest seemed to close in around them, each step pulling them deeper into the unknown. Emma and Kyle exchanged uneasy glances. What had started as a carefree hike now felt heavy, the forest oppressive. Without landmarks or a working GPS, the trail stretched endlessly ahead, no longer a friendly path but a labyrinth. And still the birdsong did not return. Kyle glanced at his watch. Nearly 2 hours had passed since they started backtracking. Sweat clung to his brow despite the cool air, and Emma's normally bright expression had dimmed with worry. "We've been walking in circles," Emma muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This can't be right." Kyle tried to sound confident, but his words faltered. "Maybe the forest just looks the same everywhere. We'll find the right path soon." Emma didn't respond, instead scanning the trees. They were all tall, their trunks smooth and uniform, their tops vanishing into a canopy that let in almost no sunlight now. The forest seemed darker than it had just an hour ago. Kyle pulled out the map again, unfolding it with a frustrated huff. "It doesn't make sense. This trail isn't even supposed to split." He pointed at the sheet, tracing a finger along the clear loop marked in red. "See, we're supposed to loop back to camp." Emma leaned in, but the map might as well have been written in another language for all the good it did them now. The trail they were on wasn't marked. The forest didn't care for red lines or carefully drawn paths. "I don't think we're on the trail anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "We must have wandered off without realizing." Kyle wanted to argue but couldn't. Deep down he knew she was right. He folded the map and shoved it into his pack. "Okay. New plan. We keep walking in one direction. The forest has to end somewhere. Worst case, we hit a road or another trail." Emma nodded, though her face betrayed little confidence. She adjusted her camera strap, the lens swinging like a pendulum with every step as they trudged forward. The forest seemed to shift with them. No matter how far they walked, the trees remained dense, the air thick. Time lost meaning. The sun was still above the horizon, but its light grew faint, as though it had given up trying to pierce the canopy. Kyle noticed other changes, too. The ground beneath their boots felt soft, almost spongy, and the air carried a faint, earthy smell that he couldn't place. He paused to catch his breath, hands on his hips, scanning the surroundings. That's when Emma saw it, a symbol carved into the bark of a tree just ahead. It was small, about the size of her palm, and intricately detailed. She stepped closer, her fingers hovering over the grooves. "What is that?" Kyle asked, joining her. The symbol wasn't like anything he'd seen before. Not a letter or number, but a strange combination of geometric shapes and curved lines. It looked ancient, like it had been there long before the forest itself. "I don't know," Emma replied, backing away. "It feels wrong." Kyle examined it for a moment longer before shaking his head. "Just some kid's idea of a prank. Let's keep moving." But as they walked on, more symbols appeared. Each tree seemed to bear a mark, all different but clearly connected. They weren't random. Kyle's pace quickened. Emma struggled to keep up, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Her heart pounded, and though she tried to focus on the path ahead, an undeniable feeling gnawed at her, a sense of being watched. The forest no longer felt indifferent. It felt alive, and it didn't want them to leave. The symbols grew more frequent, appearing on nearly every tree they passed. Each one seemed more intricate than the last, with strange patterns looping and intersecting in ways that defied logic. Emma took a photo of one, but the digital display on her camera showed only a blur where the carving should have been. "It didn't even focus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's weird." Kyle glanced at the camera, then back at the tree. Maybe the light's messing with it. But Emma wasn't convinced. Her camera had captured countless photos in worse lighting conditions, yet now it refused to focus on these markings. It was as though the symbols themselves rejected being recorded. They pressed on, the tension between them palpable. Neither spoke much now, each lost in their own uneasy thoughts. The forest seemed to be closing in around them. The trees leaned closer together, their branches interlocking above to form a nearly impenetrable canopy. The light dimmed further, casting the forest floor in an oppressive twilight. Kyle stopped abruptly, causing Emma to nearly bump into him. "Hold on," he said, crouching to the ground. A pile of smooth stones lay in the center of the trail, carefully stacked into a small cairn. "Someone's been here," he said. "This is a trail marker." Emma crouched beside him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "That's good, right? It means we're not the only ones lost out here." "Maybe," Kyle said, but his tone was hesitant. Something about the cairn felt off. It wasn't just the way the stones were stacked, but the precision of it. The stones were impossibly clean, free of moss or dirt, as though they'd been placed only moments ago. Emma reached out to touch it, but Kyle grabbed her wrist. "Don't. We don't know who put it there or why." She pulled her hand back, nodding reluctantly. "You're right, let's just keep moving." As they walked, more cairns appeared, each one positioned at the edge of the trail. They varied in size, some only a few stones high, others towering at knee level. The symbols on the trees began to change too. They were sharper now, more jagged, and seemed to grow larger the deeper they ventured. Emma noticed something else. The trail wasn't just unfamiliar, it was inconsistent. At times it was wide enough for them to walk side by side. Other times it narrowed to barely more than a footpath. The ground itself shifted, patches of dirt giving way to loose gravel, then soft moss, then back again. "It's like the trail doesn't want us to know where we're going," she muttered under her breath. Kyle gripped the revolver at his side, his knuckles white. He didn't share her observation, but he felt it too. The path was no longer a path. It was a maze, twisting and turning with no logic or reason. A branch snapped in the distance, breaking the heavy silence. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Kyle's hand instinctively moved to the revolver, his finger hovering near the trigger. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He scanned the trees, his pulse quickening. Emma stayed close to him, her camera now clutched tightly in her hands. "If it's an animal, it's not afraid of us." Kyle nodded, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he regretted not packing more than just the revolver. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. The forest felt alive, every branch, shadow, and leaf conspiring against them. Kyle kept his revolver drawn, scanning the dense trees for movement. Emma stayed behind him, her breath quick and shallow. The snapping of branches was distant now, but it felt deliberate, like whoever or whatever was making the noise wanted them to notice. The path ahead curved sharply to the right, disappearing into a thicket of trees. Kyle hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But where would they go? The trail behind them was no safer, and they had no clue how to navigate this shifting nightmare. "Stay close," Kyle said, his voice low but firm. They rounded the corner, stepping cautiously. The air here was colder, a damp chill that clung to their skin. Ahead, the path split into two. One fork led deeper into the trees, the other veered toward an open clearing. In the center of the clearing stood something that made Emma's stomach twist. It was a figure, human-shaped, but wrong. It stood perfectly still, its back to them. The figure was tall, draped in what looked like tattered clothing, the fabric hanging in strips. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening. Kyle raised the revolver, his grip steady but his mind racing. "Don't move," he whispered. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes locked on the figure. "Kyle, what is that?" "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But we're not going near it." As if hearing his words, the figure turned. Slowly, unnaturally, its head swiveled around before the rest of its body followed. The face, or what should have been a face, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a humanoid skull. Emma let out a small gasp, and the thing took a step toward them. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. Kyle aimed the revolver at its chest. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. The creature stopped, tilting its head again. For a moment it seemed to consider him. Then in a horrifying display, its body began to shift. The arms elongated, the legs bent at unnatural angles, and its torso twisted as though its bones were liquid. The blank face contorted, features emerging where none had been, Kyle's nose, Emma's eyes, a grotesque mimicry of the two of them combined. Emma stumbled back, her hands trembling. "Kyle, shoot it now." Kyle didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, the crack of the revolver shattering the eerie quiet. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a guttural, inhuman sound and darted into the trees with impossible speed. The couple stood frozen, the echoes of the gunshot fading into the distance. Kyle kept the revolver raised, his eyes scanning the forest. "It's still out there," he said, his voice grim. Emma clutched his arm. What was that thing?" Kyle didn't answer. He didn't know. But he did know one thing. They were no longer lost in an ordinary forest. Whatever had been stalking them wasn't human, and it wasn't done with them yet. The forest seemed to close in tighter after the encounter, the trees forming a labyrinth of shadows and towering walls. Every step Emma and Kyle took was measured, the weight of their fear pressing down on them like a physical force. The creature's mimicry haunted them, its grotesque transformation etched into their minds. "We can't just keep wandering," Emma said, her voice trembling. "It's out there, and it's faster than us." Kyle's grip tightened around the revolver. He scanned the woods, every rustle and flicker of movement setting his nerves on edge. "We stick together. If it comes back, I'll put it down for good." Emma nodded, though her faith in his words was limited. Their supplies were running low, and the shifting trail offered no clear direction. The fear of dehydration or starvation gnawed at her, but it paled compared to the terror of the thing hunting them. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood a makeshift hut, its walls constructed from mismatched planks of wood and covered in strips of moss and vines. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked metal pipe poking out of the roof. The sight of it brought Emma to an abrupt halt. "Do you think someone lives here?" she asked, her voice a mix of hope and disbelief. Kyle didn't lower the revolver. "Let's find out." They approached cautiously, the dry leaves crunching beneath their boots. As they neared the entrance, a gruff voice called out from within. "Don't come any closer unless you want a load of buckshot in your chest." Kyle stopped, holding up his free hand. "We're lost. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need help." There was a long silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing an old man with a wild tangle of gray hair and a beard to match. His eyes were sharp and calculating, and he held a shotgun loosely at his side. He stepped out, sizing them up. "You're on cursed land," the man said flatly, his gaze flicking to the revolver in Kyle's hand. "No one comes out here unless they're desperate or stupid." Emma stepped forward. "We didn't mean to. We got lost, and now something is chasing us." The man's face hardened. "You saw it, didn't you? The Skinwalker." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Emma and Kyle exchanged uneasy glances. "What is it?" Kyle asked. "And how do we get out of here?" The old man shook his head. "You don't. Not unless it lets you. That thing owns this forest. It's part of the curse, and it's older than any of us. If it's after you, you're as good as dead." Emma's knees wobbled, and she grabbed Kyle's arm for support. "There has to be a way. We can't just die out here." The old man sighed, stepping aside and gesturing for them to enter. "You'd better come inside. If it hasn't gotten you yet, you've still got a chance. But don't get your hopes up." Reluctantly, they followed him into the dark, musty hut. It smelled of damp wood and smoke, with strange charms hanging from the ceiling. The old man shut the door behind them, bolting it with a large iron bar. "The Skinwalker doesn't like fire," he said, tossing a log onto the small stove. "It doesn't like iron either, but don't think that'll save you. It's clever, smarter than anything you've ever met. If it's got its sights set on you, it'll find a way." Kyle leaned against the wall, his jaw tight. "So what do we do?" The old man's eyes darkened. "Pray." The dim light inside the hermit's hut flickered as the fire crackled in the iron stove. The warmth was a stark contrast to the cold dread Emma and Kyle felt. The old man moved with purpose, his rough hands sorting through an assortment of jars and trinkets scattered across a rickety wooden table. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, similar to those on the trees, but more intricate, more deliberate. Kyle stood near the door, his revolver still in hand. "You said it's part of a curse. What kind of curse traps people in a forest like this?" The old man glanced up, his sharp eyes narrowing. "The kind that's been here for centuries. This forest is a prison, not just for people, but for things far worse. The Skinwalker is just one of them." Emma shuddered, clutching her arms. "Why is it hunting us? We didn't do anything." The man scoffed, tossing a handful of dried herbs into a bowl. "You're in its territory, that's all it needs. It doesn't just kill for food, it kills to keep the curse alive. Every lost soul, every victim feeds it." Kyle's grip tightened on the revolver. "So how do we break it? There has to be a way." The hermit chuckled darkly. "Break it? You think you can outsmart an ancient force? The only reason I'm still alive is because I made a deal, a truce." Emma frowned. "A deal?" The old man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the barred door as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. "I don't leave my cabin after dark, and I don't interfere with what it hunts. In return, it leaves me alone. But you two showing up here, that complicates things." Kyle stepped forward, his tone sharp. "What do you mean?" The hermit sighed, running a hand through his tangled beard. "Helping you puts me on its list. It doesn't tolerate broken promises." Emma's face paled. "So what? You're just going to send us back out there?" The man's gaze softened, and for a moment there was a flicker of humanity beneath his gruff exterior. "No, I can't just throw you to it. I'll give you supplies, tell you what I know. But you need to understand. Once you leave this cabin, you're on your own, and it will come for you." He turned back to the table, pulling out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were crude iron spikes and a handful of small jars filled with a black tar-like substance. "These might slow it down. Iron burns it, and this," he held up one of the jars, is made from herbs it hates. Coat your bullets in it if you want to have a chance." Kyle took the bundle, his expression grim. "What about you?" The hermit gave a bitter laugh. "I'll stay here. If it's going to come for me anyway, at least I'll go down in my home." Emma's eyes welled with tears. "I'm so sorry." The old man waved her off. "Don't waste your pity on me, just focus on surviving." Before they could reply, a low guttural growl echoed through the forest, penetrating even the thick wooden walls of the cabin. The hermit froze, his face ashen. He moved to the stove, dousing the fire with a scoop of dirt. "It knows you're here," he whispered. "You need to go, now." Kyle and Emma hesitated, but the urgency in his voice left no room for argument. They gathered the supplies, Kyle reloading his revolver with the coated bullets. The hermit opened a back hatch leading into the trees. "Follow the stars," he said, his voice strained. "And don't look back, no matter what you hear." Emma started to speak, but the sound of a sharp, animalistic cry from the forest cut her off. The hermit shoved them out, slamming the hatch shut behind them. For a moment, there was silence. Then the air exploded with a terrifying, inhuman scream. Kyle and Emma sprinted through the dense forest, their breaths ragged and uneven. The trees seemed even closer now, their branches clawing at the couple as they pushed forward. The revolver felt heavy in Kyle's hand, and the iron spikes clattered in his pack with every step. The hermit's last words echoed in his mind. "Don't look back." Behind them, the creature's guttural scream tore through the air again, closer this time. Emma stumbled but caught herself, her hands trembling as she clung to Kyle's arm. "We can't just leave him," she cried, her voice shaking. Kyle slowed for a moment, his jaw clenched. "What do you want me to do? He told us to go." Another scream pierced the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Emma froze, her face pale as she turned toward the direction of the hermit's cabin. "It's there. It's going after him." Kyle grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "There's nothing we can do. He knew the risk." Emma resisted, her eyes brimming with tears. "Kyle, we can't just—" A blood-curdling howl erupted from behind them, silencing her protests. It wasn't just the scream of an animal. It was layered with something human, a twisted mockery of a voice. The sound of crashing wood and guttural growls echoed louder, signaling the chaos unfolding at the cabin. Kyle pulled her forward again, his tone firm. "Emma, if we don't move, we're next." Reluctantly, she followed, her legs trembling with every step. The forest seemed darker now, the moonlight barely cutting through the canopy. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle a threat. But the sounds from the cabin grew fainter with distance, the chaos fading into an eerie silence. Finally, the couple stopped, collapsing onto a patch of mossy ground. Emma buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "We left him to die," she whispered. Kyle sat beside her, his hand still gripping the revolver. He made his choice. He knew what helping us meant. Emma looked up, tears streaking her face. "What if it comes for us next? What if we're leading it right to us?" Kyle's jaw tightened and he checked the cylinder of the revolver, making sure every coated bullet was ready. "Then we'll be ready." A sudden crack of branches from the direction they had come made them both freeze. Kyle rose to his feet, his revolver aimed toward the sound. The forest fell deathly silent, save for their ragged breathing. "I don't think it's over," Emma said, her voice barely audible. The quiet stretched, oppressive and suffocating, before a new sound broke through. It wasn't the scream of the creature this time. It was a low, wet scraping, like something dragging itself across the forest floor. Emma's face paled. "It's here." Kyle steadied his aim, his muscles tense. The scraping grew louder, punctuated by faint clicking sounds. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. And then it stepped into view. The Skinwalker was no longer imitating them. Its body was grotesque, a writhing mass of elongated limbs and shifting shapes. Its face twisted between forms, one moment blank and smooth, the next resembling the hermit's twisted features. Blood dripped from its claws, staining the mossy ground beneath it. Kyle didn't hesitate. He fired once, the shot ringing out and striking the creature in its chest. It recoiled, a hiss escaping its distorted mouth, but it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged forward with horrifying speed. "Run," Kyle shouted, grabbing Emma and pulling her away. The Skinwalker's guttural growl echoed behind them as it gave chase, unrelenting in its pursuit. The forest became a blur of shadows and flickering light as Kyle and Emma sprinted, their boots pounding against the uneven ground. The Skinwalker's guttural growls were impossibly close, the sound like nails scraping against stone, sending shivers through their bodies. Kyle pushed Emma ahead, his revolver gripped tightly in his hand. He glanced back and saw the creature moving with an unnatural gait, its twisted limbs jerking as it leaped from tree to tree, closing the distance with terrifying speed. "Keep going," Kyle shouted, firing a shot over his shoulder. The bullet struck the creature in its shoulder, the iron-coated round making it recoil with a shriek. It stumbled, but didn't stop, its twisted form contorting as it adapted to the wound. Emma's breathing was ragged, her legs burning from the effort of running. "We can't outrun it forever," she cried, her voice breaking with panic. Kyle knew she was right. He scanned the dense forest, his mind racing for a plan. Ahead, he spotted a cluster of fallen trees and jagged rocks, terrain difficult to navigate, even for something as unnatural as the Skinwalker. "This way," he said, pulling Emma toward the debris. They scrambled over the uneven ground, the sharp edges of the rocks cutting into their palms. Kyle turned and fired another shot, the creature dodging with inhuman precision. It let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the forest. As they climbed over the largest fallen tree, Kyle stopped and turned to face the creature. "Go, Emma, keep moving," he ordered, his revolver aimed at the beast. "No, I'm not leaving you," Emma protested, but the look in Kyle's eyes made her hesitate. He was resolute, determined to give her a chance to escape. The Skinwalker emerged from the shadows, its form larger and more grotesque than before. Its body seemed to ripple, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it crouched, ready to pounce. Kyle steadied his aim, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered, firing 2 quick shots. Both bullets struck true, the creature letting out a shriek as the iron burned its flesh. It faltered, its movements jerky and disjointed, but it didn't fall. Kyle fired again, the last bullet in the chamber hitting the creature square in its chest. The Skinwalker howled in pain, collapsing to the ground in a writhing heap. Black ichor oozed from its wounds, sizzling as it hit the forest floor. Emma climbed back over the fallen tree, grabbing Kyle's arm. "Is it dead?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kyle reloaded the revolver with shaking hands, his eyes never leaving the creature's still form. "I don't know. We can't take any chances." Together, they backed away, keeping their distance from the creature. It lay motionless, its body twisted and broken, but neither of them dared to turn their back on it. The forest was silent again, the oppressive tension lifting slightly. Kyle grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her along. "Let's go. If it gets back up, I'm not sticking around to find out." They ran, their footsteps echoing through the quiet woods. Behind them, the creature's body remained still, the black ichor pooling beneath it. But as the couple disappeared into the distance, a faint twitch ran through its twisted limbs, its grotesque form beginning to stir once more. Emma and Kyle pushed forward, the forest a disorienting maze of darkness and shifting shadows. Every muscle in their bodies screamed for rest, but they didn't dare stop. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight of fear propelling them onward. Kyle's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. The Skinwalker had survived so much already, iron bullets, injuries that would kill anything natural, and it was still pursuing them. He knew their options were running out. "There," Emma shouted, pointing ahead. The faint glow of moonlight revealed a shallow ravine bordered by massive boulders. It wasn't much, but it offered the semblance of cover. Kyle nodded, and they made their way down into the gully, careful to stay low. "We have to make a stand here," Kyle said, his voice strained but resolute. He reached into his pack, pulling out the iron spikes and jars of the tar-like substance the hermit had given them. Emma crouched beside him, her hands trembling as she took one of the jars. "What do we do? Coat these spikes?" Kyle nodded, working quickly to smear the sticky substance onto the spikes and the remaining bullets. "We don't have enough to fight this thing forever. We'll set a trap and force it to come to us." Emma looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, but didn't argue. Together, they arranged the spikes in a loose semicircle around their position, embedding them into the soft earth. The jagged points glinted faintly in the moonlight, creating a makeshift barrier. The forest above the ravine was eerily quiet, the silence pressing down on them like a weight. Emma's hands shook as she smeared the last jar of the tar onto a large branch, placing it in the center of their trap. Kyle loaded the revolver with his remaining coated bullets, his jaw set in determination. "Stay behind me. If it gets through, we run. No hesitation." Emma nodded, gripping her camera like a lifeline, though it was little more than dead weight now. Her eyes darted to the edge of the ravine where the trees loomed like sentinels. The silence stretched, every second feeling like an eternity. Then it came. The Skinwalker appeared at the top of the ravine, its grotesque form silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Its body twisted and shifted, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its face an ever-changing mask of terror. It let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. Kyle raised the revolver, aiming at the creature's chest. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The Skinwalker leaped into the ravine with shocking speed, landing just outside the circle of spikes. It hesitated, its elongated limbs twitching as if sensing the trap. Then, with a horrifying screech, it lunged forward. Kyle fired, the first bullet striking the creature in its shoulder. It let out a blood-curdling scream, but didn't stop. The second shot hit its torso, and the third landed square in its head. The Skinwalker stumbled, its movements jerky and erratic, but it didn't fall. Kyle fired again, the fourth and fifth shots striking the creature in rapid succession. Finally, with a bone-rattling roar, it collapsed inside the circle of spikes, its body convulsing as the iron and tar burned its flesh. Emma clutched Kyle's arm, her voice trembling. Is it dead?" Kyle stared at the creature, its body twisted and broken, the black ichor oozing from its wounds. It wasn't moving. He lowered the revolver, his breathing ragged. "I think so." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The oppressive silence of the forest seemed to lift slightly, and the faint rustle of leaves returned. It felt as though the nightmare might finally be over. But Kyle didn't trust it. "Let's get out of here. Now." Emma nodded, and together they climbed out of the ravine, leaving the creature's smoldering body behind. They didn't look back, the weight of exhaustion and fear driving them toward what they hoped was the edge of the cursed woods. The Skinwalker lay motionless in the ravine, its twisted form surrounded by the charred remains of the trap. But as the couple disappeared into the distance, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch ran through its limbs. Its work wasn't done. The forest began to thin as Emma and Kyle pressed on, their steps fueled by sheer willpower. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive silence that had weighed on them for hours was replaced by the faint sounds of wind rustling through the trees. For the first time since they had become lost, Emma felt a flicker of hope. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead. Kyle squinted, his heart skipping a beat. Through the trees, the faint glow of a clearing came into view. Relief washed over him like a wave. "That has to be the trailhead," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The couple quickened their pace, the promise of escape lending strength to their exhausted bodies. When they emerged from the forest, they found themselves on a wide dirt path, the remnants of an old trailhead sign leaning against a tree. The sight of it nearly brought Emma to tears. "We made it," she said, her voice breaking. Kyle scanned the area, his revolver still in hand. Though the open space felt safer, he couldn't shake the unease that clung to him. The memory of the Skinwalker's grotesque form, its resilience, and its unnatural presence lingered in his mind. He didn't dare lower his guard. "Let's keep moving," he said. "We need to get as far from here as we can." They followed the dirt path until they reached the gravel parking lot where they had left their car. The sight of it felt surreal, like a lifeline back to the world they thought they might never see again. Kyle fumbled with the keys, unlocking the car with shaking hands. Emma climbed into the passenger seat, her body sagging against the door. "We're safe now, right?" Kyle didn't answer immediately. He slid into the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the tree line one last time. Nothing moved. The forest stood silent, its shadows no longer reaching for them. "I think so," he finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. As they drove down the winding road away from the trailhead, the tension began to ease. The darkness of the forest gave way to open fields and distant lights. The nightmare they had endured felt like it was finally behind them. But deep in the forest, the Skinwalker was stirring. Its body lay broken and twisted in the ravine, the black ichor that oozed from its wounds slowly coagulating. The iron spikes still pierced its flesh, but its grotesque form began to shift, bones snapping back into place, limbs straightening. It rose on unsteady legs, its featureless face twisting into something that resembled a smile. The creature moved toward the edge of the ravine, its twisted body melting into the shadows as it climbed out. The curse of the forest demanded sustenance, and it was not yet satisfied. Back in the car, Emma glanced at Kyle, her voice hesitant. "What do we do now?" Kyle kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "We move on. We don't talk about it. We don't come back." Emma nodded, but neither of them noticed the faint reflection in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, something pale and featureless appeared in the back seat before vanishing into the shadows of the car. So it all started one boring Friday night. My friend Jake and I were hanging out in my dorm room. We were both pretty curious about the dark web. You know, that part of the internet where all the sketchy stuff happens? We'd heard a ton of stories about it, but never actually checked it out ourselves. Jake leaned back in his chair and said, "Hey man, why don't we see what the dark web is really about?" I was a bit nervous, honestly. I'd read some pretty freaky stuff online about it. But Jake was super persuasive, and I figured, what's the worst that could happen? So, we spent the next hour or so downloading Tor and setting up everything. It felt weird, like we were sneaking into some forbidden place. At first, it was kind of underwhelming. We found forums talking about illegal stuff, markets selling weird things like fake IDs and crazy expensive pets. It was creepy, sure, but not as shocking as I expected. Just when I was about to tell Jake we should quit, he found this link that caught our attention. It was called Exclusive Auction Tonight. "Should we check it out?" Jake asked, sounding excited but a little scared too. "Yeah, why not? One last thing before we call it a night," I replied, my heart pounding. We clicked the link and it took us to this black page with a countdown timer. It said, "Auction starts in 10 minutes." We both looked at each other, nervous but curious. When the timer finally hit 0, the page changed. There was a list of items up for auction. Most of it was stuff like gadgets and rare collectibles. But then things got really messed up. There were names on the list, names with pictures of people next to them. Regular people like you and me. I felt sick when I realized what we were seeing. They were selling people. Actual human beings. The chat on the side of the screen was blowing up with people placing bids, all of them acting like this was totally normal. Jake and I just sat there frozen in horror. Then, as the list kept scrolling, we saw something that made my heart stop. Our names popped up, with our photos. We were on the list. Someone was selling us. Jake gasped, and I felt like I was going to throw up. How did they get our info? Who were these people? My mind was racing, but I knew one thing. We had to get out of there fast. "Shut it down," I yelled, my voice cracking. Jake scrambled to close all the windows. We even yanked out the Ethernet cable just in case. I slammed the laptop shut and we just sat there breathing hard. I looked at Jake, and he was as pale as a ghost. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered, shaking. I had no clue. All I knew was that our curiosity had led us into some serious trouble. We didn't say much after that. The room was dead silent, except for our breathing. "Should we call the cops?" Jake asked after a while. I shook my head. "And tell them what? That we were messing around on the dark web and found ourselves on some freaky auction list? They'll think we're nuts." He nodded, but I could tell he was terrified. So was I. We'd gotten ourselves into something way over our heads. We just sat there, too scared to move, wondering what the heck we were going to do next. That night, neither of us got any sleep. Every little sound made us jump. It felt like we were being watched. I had no idea what was coming, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. This was just the beginning of our nightmare. The next day, Jake and I tried to act normal. We went to classes, hung out with friends, and tried not to think about what we saw. But I couldn't stop feeling like someone was watching me. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Every time I saw someone looking at me, I got paranoid. A few days later, I noticed something strange. I was walking to the library, and this guy was just standing there, staring at me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I saw him again the next day, and the day after that, always just watching. I told Jake about it, but he said I was overreacting. Maybe he's just a student with the same schedule, he said, but I could tell he was worried too. Then Jake started noticing things too. One evening, we were in the cafeteria when Jake nudged me. "Don't look now, but there's a guy over there who's been staring at us for the past 10 minutes. I glanced over, trying to be casual, and saw this middle-aged guy in all black just staring at us. My stomach did a flip. We left the cafeteria quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next week, it got worse. Sometimes it was the same guy, sometimes it was different people, but they were always there watching us. They never came close, never talked to us, just watched. One evening, I was walking back to my dorm alone after a late study session. The campus was quiet, and the streetlights were casting long shadows. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and steady. I looked back and saw a man in a hoodie following me. My heart started racing. I walked faster, but he kept up. I finally made it back to my dorm and rushed inside, locking the door behind me. I was shaking, and it took a while to calm down. I told Jake, and he looked scared too. "We need to do something, man. This is getting out of hand," he said. The next day, we went to campus security. We told them about the strange people following us, but didn't mention the dark web. We didn't want to sound crazy. The officer we talked to was polite but seemed skeptical. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, writing down some notes. "But if you see anything concrete, let us know immediately." That night, Jake and I locked ourselves in my room. We were scared and tired, not knowing what to do. It felt like our normal lives were slipping away, replaced by constant fear. The feeling of being watched was always there, like a shadow that wouldn't leave us alone. We tried to figure out what to do next, but I couldn't help feeling that things were about to get much worse. A few days went by and we were still really freaked out. The weird people following us didn't stop, and it felt like things were getting worse. One night, out of pure desperation, Jake and I decided to go back on the dark web. Maybe we could find some clues about what was going on. We set everything up again, making sure to use all the security stuff. My hands were shaking as we logged back in. We found the same auction site pretty quickly. My heart was racing as we clicked on it. The page loaded, and there it was. Our names, our photos. But this time it was even worse. Next to our names it said, "Sold for $50,000, to be delivered soon." I felt like I was going to throw up. Jake just stared at the screen, his face pale. We sat there in silence for a minute, trying to understand what we were seeing. Someone had bought us for $50,000, and they were expecting delivery soon. "What does that even mean?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know, man," I said, feeling a cold sweat. "But we need to figure this out." We started searching the site for more information, but there wasn't much to find. Just a lot of creepy auctions and shady chats. The chat was still going, with people talking about all sorts of illegal stuff. It made my skin crawl. After a while, we shut everything down again. We were both in shock. Someone had paid a lot of money for us, and we had no idea who or why. The only thing we knew was that we had to do something, and fast. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, breaking the silence. "Like, leave campus, maybe even the city." "Where would we go?" I asked, feeling completely lost. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. It's not safe." He was right. We were being watched, and now we knew someone had plans for us. Plans we couldn't even begin to understand. We packed some essentials, grabbed our laptops, and decided to lay low at a friend's place off campus. On our way out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that someone was out there waiting. The thought of being delivered to some unknown buyer was terrifying. We had to stay one step ahead, but with no real plan and no idea who was after us, it felt like we were in deep trouble. That night at our friend's place, we barely slept. We knew we couldn't hide forever, but we didn't know where to turn. The reality of our situation was sinking in, and it felt like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. As the hours went by, we tried to come up with a plan. We needed help, but we didn't know who to trust. The only thing we knew for sure was that time was running out. After that crazy night, Jake and I knew we had to leave. We couldn't stay on campus, and we didn't trust telling anyone. We decided to just run. We packed a few things, clothes, our laptops, some cash, and left our phones behind. It felt weird, but we had to do it. We caught a bus to a city a few hours away. From there, we got on a train to the nearest international airport. We didn't talk much. Both of us were too freaked out. At the airport, we used cash to buy tickets to the first flight out. We ended up going to Mexico. It wasn't planned, but we needed to get out of the country and lay low. The flight was tense. I kept looking around, worried someone might be following us. But we made it to Mexico without any problems. Once we landed, we found a cheap hotel and just crashed. We were exhausted. For the next few days, we moved around a lot. We stayed in different hostels, trying not to stay in one place too long. We didn't want to draw any attention. It was stressful, but at least we felt a bit safer being away from home. We spent our days figuring out what to do next. We used internet cafes to check the news back home, but we avoided the dark web. We didn't want to risk being found again. After a while, we started to relax a little. Mexico was big, and we felt like we could hide there for a while. We made some basic plans to get by, like finding odd jobs for cash and keeping a low profile. It wasn't easy, but it was better than being back home, constantly being in fear and terror that someone might kidnap us or, even worse, kill us. We knew this couldn't last forever, but for now, it was about surviving. Months went by since Jake and I left everything behind. We kept moving around, staying low, and after a while, it felt like no one was looking for us anymore. We hadn't seen any sign of those creepy people and hadn't heard anything that made us think we were still in danger. We decided it was time to start over. We ended up in Switzerland. It felt safe and far away from all the craziness back home. We used some of the cash we had to get new IDs and tried to build a new life. It was tough at first. We had to figure out how to live in a new country, learn a bit of the language, and find jobs. But we stuck together and managed to make it work. Jake found a job at a local cafe, and I started working at a small bookstore. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was stable. We rented a small apartment and started to settle in. We kept our heads down and didn't share much about our past with anyone. Making friends was hard with such a big secret, but it felt necessary. As time went on, we got more comfortable. Switzerland started to feel like home. We even talked about going back to school to finish our degrees someday. For now, though, we were just happy to feel safe and free from the constant fear. Starting over was hard, but it felt worth it. We had a second chance, and we weren't going to waste it. We had to be careful, but for the first time in a long while, we felt hopeful. Our lives were different now, but they were ours. We had been through something terrible, and now we were building something new. It wasn't the life we had planned, but it was a life we could live with, and that was enough. Every day, things got a bit easier. We missed home sometimes, but we knew we couldn't go back. We kept each other motivated and tried to stay positive. It was weird living with such a big secret, but we focused on our new start. Eventually, Switzerland really did start to feel like a fresh beginning. We made some new friends, found hobbies we liked, and even started feeling a bit more relaxed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than living in constant fear. So that's where we are now. A new country, a new life, and hopefully, a better future. We don't know what will happen next, but we're ready. Alright, so let me just start by saying that I'm one of those people who likes to poke around where they probably shouldn't. The kind of person who gets a kick out of exploring the weird parts of the internet. I know it sounds crazy, but there's something about the thrill of finding bizarre stuff online that gets me every time. Anyway, one night I was bored out of my mind and decided to take another dive into the dark web. I'd done it a few times before, mostly finding boring or sketchy stuff. But this time it was different. I came across this marketplace called the Cursed Curiosities Emporium. Just the name of it was enough to make my skin crawl a bit. The website looked old and creepy, like it was straight out of a horror movie. They were selling all sorts of weird things like cursed relics, haunted objects, and dark magic items. At first, I thought it was just some joke, like some Halloween store. But as I scrolled through the items, I started to feel like this might be something more serious. Then I saw it. A creepy-looking voodoo doll. The picture showed this raggedy doll, stitched together with old fabric and what looked like human hair. Its eyes were these black buttons and its mouth was sewn into this creepy grin. The description said it was found in an old house in New Orleans and that it was cursed. The price was way too high for what looked like an old toy, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't know what came over me, but before I knew it, I had added the doll to my cart and was checking out. It felt like some kind of game, like I was testing the limits of what I would actually do. The site took cryptocurrency, which made the whole thing feel even more secretive. I finished the purchase, closed my laptop, and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't shake this weird feeling. About a week later, a small plain package showed up at my door. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with an old string. There was no return address, just my name written in small, neat letters. I felt a little scared, but I was also super curious. I brought the package inside, set it on my kitchen table, and carefully unwrapped it. Inside there was a bunch of straw, and nestled in it was the voodoo doll. It looked even creepier in person, and it had this weird smell, like old wood and something metallic. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. It felt heavy, and I could feel little lumps inside like it was filled with small stones or beans. I ended up putting the doll on a shelf in my living room. I thought it would be a funny thing to show my friends, a weird conversation starter. But looking back, that was the start of everything. That one decision was about to lead to some of the scariest moments of my life. Alright, so I've never been one to believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that supernatural stuff. That's a big part of why I ordered the doll in the first place. I thought it was just a creepy toy, something to give me a good laugh and maybe freak out my friends. But after it arrived, weird things started happening around my house and I couldn't ignore it. A few days after putting the doll on the shelf, I noticed little things that felt off. Like I'd come home from work and the front door would be slightly open. I always lock my door, so it was weird, but I figured I was just being careless. Then I started finding my stuff in odd places. My keys, which I always leave on the kitchen counter, would be on the coffee table. My shoes would be in the middle of the hallway when I knew I had left them by the door. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being forgetful or clumsy. One night, I was watching TV, and I heard a noise from the kitchen. It sounded like something fell. I got up to check, and there was a knife on the floor. It had been on the counter. The windows were closed. No breeze, no reason for it to fall. It didn't make sense. Another time I was getting ready for bed and noticed the bathroom door was wide open. I always keep it closed. As I walked over to shut it, I felt a cold breeze. All the windows were shut tight. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but it felt so real. Things kept getting weirder. I'd hear soft whispers in the middle of the night, like someone was standing right outside my bedroom door. I'd wake up and find strange symbols drawn in the dust on my shelves. The doll seemed to move slightly each time I looked at it, like its head or arms had shifted a bit. It was freaking me out. I knew it sounded crazy, and I didn't want anyone to think I was losing it, so I didn't tell anyone at first. But the unease kept growing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house, that something was watching me. One evening, I decided to test a theory. I set up my phone to record the living room overnight, pointing it directly at the doll. I thought maybe I'd catch some footage of what was happening, or at least prove to myself that it was all in my head. The next morning, I watched the video. For hours, nothing happened. But then, around 3 a.m., the doll moved. It wasn't much, just a slight shift of its head and arms, but it was enough. My blood ran cold. I replayed the video several times, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. I had to find out more about the doll and the curse that supposedly came with it. So I've got this old manual telephone that used to belong to my grandma. It's more of a decoration now, sitting on a small table in the living room. I never use it, but it still works. One night, a few days after all the weird stuff started happening with the doll, the phone started making these strange static sounds. It was weird because I hadn't touched it in ages, and it shouldn't have been making any noise at all. At first, I thought it was just interference from some electronic device nearby, so I ignored it. But the static kept getting louder, more insistent. It was like the phone was demanding my attention. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I walked over to the table and picked up the receiver to see if I could figure out what was going on. The moment I held the receiver to my ear, the static intensified. It was harsh and loud, making my ear ring. Through the crackling noise, I started to hear what sounded like a voice. It was faint and distorted, but definitely a voice. My heart began to race. I strained to make out what was being said, pressing the receiver closer to my ear. The voice was garbled, almost like it was coming from a great distance. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded angry and desperate, like someone trying to communicate through layers of interference. The more I listened, the clearer it became that this wasn't just random noise. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Fear gripped me. The room seemed to grow colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. My breathing became shallow as the voice continued its unintelligible rant. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but it felt too real, too immediate. My hands were shaking, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. I dropped the receiver and backed away from the phone, my mind racing with possibilities. Was this connected to the doll? Was I really hearing a voice? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? The logical part of my brain screamed for a rational explanation, but another part, the terrified part, knew something was seriously wrong. Unable to stay in the house a second longer, I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the front door. I ran down the street, not stopping until I was several blocks away. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and my heart pounded in my chest. I found a bench in a small park and collapsed onto it, trying to calm myself and think about what to do next. As I sat there, my mind whirled with fear and confusion. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of them. The strange occurrences with the doll, the symbols in the dust, the whispers in the night, and now the haunted telephone. It all seemed connected, but I couldn't see how. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to start. I decided I couldn't go back home, at least not until I had a plan. I needed to figure out what was happening before things got worse. Maybe I could research more about the doll, find out its history, and see if anyone else had experienced similar things. I pulled out my phone and started searching for anything I could find about cursed voodoo dolls and haunted objects, hoping to find some clue that would help me understand what I was dealing with. After sitting on that park bench for a while, I decided to call my friend Mike. He's one of the few people who wouldn't think I was completely crazy. I told him everything. The doll, the weird stuff happening in my house, and the creepy phone call. He listened without interrupting, which was a relief. When I finished, Mike suggested we do some research together. We spent the next couple of hours looking up anything we could find about cursed voodoo dolls and haunted objects. Most of the articles we found, both on the regular web and some sketchy sites on the dark web, said the same thing. Burning the doll should break the curse. We decided to go back to my place and deal with it. Mike grabbed a metal trash can from his garage and we picked up some lighter fluid on the way. When we got to my house, the unease hit me again. Everything was exactly as I had left it. But the place felt different, heavier. We went straight to the living room where the doll was sitting on the shelf. Just looking at it gave me chills. Mike didn't waste any time. He grabbed the doll and tossed it into the metal trash can. I poured the lighter fluid over it, soaking the old fabric and hair. We both stepped back and Mike lit a match. As soon as the match hit the doll, it went up in flames. The fire burned bright and hot, and for a moment I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. We stood there, watching it burn, making sure it was completely destroyed. The flames flickered and danced, consuming the doll until there was nothing left but ash. When the fire finally died down, we waited a bit longer just to be sure. The air in the room seemed lighter, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We cleaned up the mess, disposed of the ashes, and I thanked Mike for his help. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The house was quiet. No strange noises. No creepy whispers. It seemed like burning the doll had done the trick. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally relax and put this whole nightmare behind me. I really thought burning the doll would fix everything, and for a few days it seemed like it did. The house was quiet, and I finally felt like I could relax. But then, the weird stuff started happening again. One night, I started hearing the noises again. The soft whispers, the strange creaks, and that creepy static sound from the old phone. It was like the nightmare had never ended. I was beyond frustrated and scared. Mike and I had missed an important detail in our research. We were supposed to cover all the mirrors before burning the doll. Apparently, mirrors can trap spirits or curses. I looked around my house, and sure enough, there were mirrors everywhere. The thought of the curse being trapped in a mirror made my skin crawl. I couldn't deal with this any longer. I decided the only way to be sure was to get rid of all the mirrors in the house. I went from room to room, smashing every mirror. It was chaotic and loud, but I didn't care. I just wanted it all to stop. Glass shards were everywhere, but I felt a weird sense of relief with each broken mirror. Once they were all gone, I cleaned up the mess and sat down, exhausted. For a while, things were quiet again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I was done taking chances. I decided to sell the house. I couldn't live there anymore, not after everything that had happened. I listed the house and moved out as soon as I could. Looking back, it was the biggest mistake of my life. I should have known that curses aren't so easily escaped. I've since moved far away, and I stay away from anything related to voodoo or curses. I've learned my lesson the hard way. This stuff is real, and it's not something to mess with. If you ever come across something like that, take my advice. Leave it alone. Don't be like me. Hey everyone, I need to share something that's been eating at me for a while. It's about my friend Chris. He was always into computers and could do things with them that seemed like magic. We met in college, bonded over tech stuff, and became really close. Chris was the kind of guy who would joke about hacking into big systems like the CIA. We laughed it off, never taking it seriously. But one night, after a few drinks, Chris looked at me and said, "I'm going to hack the CIA, just to see if I can." I laughed, but something in his eyes told me he wasn't kidding. Over the next few weeks, Chris became more distant. He stopped hanging out and replying to texts. When I did see him, he looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a strange, intense look on his face. Then, late one night, I got a message from Chris. It just said, "I'm done." It was around 3 a.m., and I was half asleep. I texted back, asking what he meant, but got no response. The next day I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I went to his apartment, but he wasn't there. It was like he had vanished. Chris didn't have any family nearby, and most of his friends were our mutual friends. We all tried to find him, but he was just gone. His apartment was empty except for his laptop sitting on his desk. I was scared but curious, so I opened the laptop. There was a single text file named "Read Me." My hands were shaking as I opened it. It read, "If you're reading this, something went wrong. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. They're watching. They know everything. I found documents about experiments, things we can't imagine. If you value your life, you'll stop reading now. Destroy this laptop. Forget you knew me. They're coming for me, and they'll come for you too. Chris." My heart was pounding. This couldn't be real, right? But it didn't seem like a joke. Chris wouldn't just disappear and leave a message like that. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My friend hacked the CIA and now he's missing? They'd think I was crazy or worse, involved. So I did what Chris said. I smashed the laptop with a hammer and threw the pieces into the river. Life didn't go back to normal. Every knock on my door, every unknown number calling me, made me jump. I started seeing shadows everywhere and felt like I was being watched. Weeks turned into months with no sign of Chris. His disappearance became a cold case. Then, almost a year later, I got a message from an unknown number. "You should have listened." I haven't slept properly since. Every night I wonder if tonight is the night they'll come for me. And if you're reading this, I beg you, stop now. Forget you ever saw this. Some things are better left alone. So after reading that message from Chris, I knew I had to destroy the laptop, but just smashing it with a hammer didn't seem like enough. I needed to make sure it was completely gone. I drove out to an empty parking lot in the middle of nowhere. I put the laptop on the ground and ran over it with my car a few times. I heard it crunch under my tires, which was kind of satisfying but also terrifying. Then I picked up the pieces, drove to a secluded spot, and started a small fire. I burned everything, watching it turn to ash. It felt like a scene from a movie, but this was real, and I was scared out of my mind. I hoped it would be enough to keep me safe. For a while, things seemed quiet. I tried to go back to my normal life, but I was always on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder and jumping at small noises. My friends noticed something was off, but I couldn't tell them the whole story. I mean, who would believe it? Then weird things started happening. I noticed different cars parked near my apartment, always different but never familiar. People in suits walked by my window, looking out of place in my neighborhood. It felt like someone was watching me all the time. One night, I was sitting in my living room when I heard tapping on my window. My heart stopped. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The tapping continued, slow and steady. Finally, I peeked through the blinds, but no one was there. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It said, "This is your last warning." My hands shook as I read it. I was terrified. Who could I tell? The police wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, it might make things worse. I tried to stay calm, but I was getting paranoid. I kept my phone off, avoided social media, and stopped talking to anyone about Chris. I even changed my locks and got a security system, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Then one evening, I got another text from an unknown number. "We're watching." That was it. No threats, just a reminder that they were still there, waiting. I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to get away, disappear just like Chris did. So, I packed a bag with essentials, took out as much cash as I could from the bank, and left my apartment. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove, heading towards nowhere in particular, hoping to find some place where they couldn't find me. Now I'm living off the grid, constantly moving from place to place. I use burner phones, pay in cash, and avoid anything traceable. It's a lonely life, but it's the only way I can stay safe. So after a few months of constantly moving and trying to stay off the grid, I thought I was finally getting a handle on things. I was staying in this cheap motel, way out of the way. I felt sort of safe, like I was finally ahead of whoever might be looking for me. One night, really late, I was just about to go to sleep when I heard this loud knock on the door. It was weird because no one knew I was there. Before I could even get up, the door was kicked open, and 3 guys in black suits burst in. They looked just like the men in black you see in movies, but this wasn't a movie. They grabbed me, put a hood over my head, and dragged me out. I tried to fight back, but they were way too strong. They threw me into the back of a van and we drove for what felt like forever. When we finally stopped, they pulled me out and took me into some building. I couldn't see anything because of the hood. When they finally took the hood off, I was in this small room with no windows. There was just one light hanging from the ceiling, and it made the whole place look even creepier. They sat me down in a chair, cuffed my hands to the table, and started asking questions. They kept asking about Chris. What do you know about Chris? What did he find? Who have you told? I kept telling them I didn't know anything, that I was just scared and running because of the weird messages and everything that had happened, but they didn't believe me. This went on for 2 months. Every day they questioned me for hours. They wouldn't let me sleep properly, and the food was terrible. I was losing weight and getting weaker. It was awful. I kept begging them to believe me, to let me go, but they kept thinking I was hiding something. It felt like it would never end. Then out of nowhere they stopped. One day they just came into the room, uncuffed me, and took me outside. They put me back in the van, drove for hours, and then just dumped me in the middle of nowhere. One of the guys looked at me and said, "You're free to go, but remember, we're always watching. Don't try anything stupid." I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. Eventually, I found my way to a small town and got some help. I knew I had to disappear again, but this time I was even more careful. Those guys were serious, and I knew they wouldn't hesitate to come after me again if they thought I was a threat. Now, I live in constant fear. I'm always on the move, never staying in one place for too long. I knew they were still watching me, but I couldn't get Chris out of my head. I felt like I needed to go to his place one last time, just to see if I missed anything. I knew most of his hiding spots, so maybe there was something still there. I decided to go at night, thinking it might be safer. I drove to his old apartment, parked a few blocks away, and walked the rest of the way. His place was still empty, just like it had been since he vanished. When I got inside, I started looking around. Chris had shown me all his hiding spots over the years. I checked under the floorboards, behind the loose bricks in the wall, and in the secret compartment in his desk. But I found nothing. It was like he never lived there. I spent hours going through every corner, hoping to find something that could explain what happened. But it was useless. Everything was gone. It felt like he had wiped away every trace of his existence. Standing in his empty apartment, I realized that this was it. There was nothing left to find. I had to accept that. Holding on to hope of finding something was just making things worse for me. As I left his apartment for the last time, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I knew I had to let go. I couldn't keep putting myself in danger. This is the last time I'm talking or thinking about Chris. It's too dangerous to keep digging. I need to move on with my life, as hard as that is. If you've read this far, please take my advice and stay away from all of this. Some things are better left alone. After everything that happened with Chris, I knew I had to move on. I decided to focus on my career and stay away from anything risky. No more dark web, no more dangerous situations. I put all my energy into my job. I started taking on extra projects and learning new skills. It felt good to focus on something positive and productive. I spent a lot of time working, trying to improve myself and my prospects. After a while, I decided to start my own business. It was a small idea at first, but I put everything I had into it. Setting up a website, finding clients, and slowly building it up took a lot of time and effort, but it was worth it. It kept me busy and gave me something to look forward to. I made sure to keep my distance from anything that could pull me back into that dark place. No more hacking, no more secret files. I learned my lesson. I realized that some things are better left alone. Now, I'm just trying to live a normal life. I get up, go to work, and come home. I spend time with my friends and family, and I'm careful about who I trust. Sometimes I still think about Chris, but I know I have to move on. If you're reading this, please take my advice. Stay away from dangerous paths. Focus on your life, your goals, and the people who care about you. It's not worth risking everything for secrets that are better left hidden. Thanks for listening. Stay safe. When I was in middle school, I had a classmate named Tommy Davis. Tommy was the kind of kid who was always a bit on the fringes. He wasn't unpopular or bullied, but he definitely wasn't part of the in crowd either. He had a quiet intensity about him, always seemed deep in thought, and had this uncanny ability to disappear into the background even when he was right in front of you. We all noticed it, but none of us really paid it much mind. That was just Tommy. One day, Tommy didn't show up to school. It was strange because he was never the type to skip classes. Our teacher, Mrs. Williams, mentioned that she hadn't received any call from his parents. As the day went on, the usual chatter and jokes in the hallways seemed subdued, as if a shadow had fallen over the school. We were young and naive, not knowing how to process the odd absence of one of our own. Days turned into weeks, and Tommy's absence became more and more unsettling. His parents were frantic, of course. They reported him missing, and the police launched an investigation. Posters with Tommy's face plastered on them went up around town. But as time passed, they grew weathered and forgotten, much like our memories of him. The whispers and rumors at school ranged from the mundane to the outlandish. Some said he ran away, others thought he was kidnapped, and a few even speculated he had been taken by something not entirely human. The police questioned everyone, including us classmates. I remember sitting in a small room, the officer's stern face trying to coax out any small detail I might have noticed. But there was nothing. Tommy was just gone, as if he had vanished into thin air. There were no leads, no clues, nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Years went by, and the memory of Tommy Davis faded into the background of my mind, a ghostly whisper in the corridors of my past. I went on with my life, high school, college, a job, and eventually a family of my own. But every now and then something would remind me of Tommy, and I'd feel a cold shiver run down my spine. It wasn't until 20 years later that I stumbled upon something that would drag all those old memories back into the harsh light of day. It was a late night, and I was browsing the internet, unable to sleep. My wife and kids were already in bed, and the house was eerily silent. I'd always been curious about the dark web, that hidden part of the internet filled with all sorts of illicit activities and forbidden knowledge. It was a morbid curiosity, the kind that draws people to horror movies or true crime stories. I'd read about how to access the dark web safely, using a Tor browser and VPNs. I told myself it was just for fun, a harmless thrill to pass the time. But deep down, I knew there was something darker pulling me toward it. I spent hours clicking through links, exploring forums and marketplaces, each one more unsettling than the last. Then I stumbled upon a thread that caught my attention. The Lost Ones, people who disappeared without a trace. The thread was filled with stories, some clearly fabricated, others hauntingly plausible. I scrolled through post after post, my heart pounding in my chest when I saw it. A name that stopped me cold. Tommy Davis. My hands trembled as I clicked on the link. The article was long and detailed, filled with grainy photos and disturbing anecdotes. It claimed that Tommy had been taken by a group of individuals who operated in the shadows of the dark web, a group known for their involvement in all sorts of nefarious activities. The article suggested that Tommy had been coerced or possibly even brainwashed into working with these people, performing tasks that ranged from hacking to more sinister endeavors. I felt a sickening dread as I read on, the details becoming more and more horrifying. The author of the article claimed to have insider knowledge, even posting supposed screenshots of conversations with Tommy. The language was crude and cryptic, filled with references to things that made my skin crawl. There were mentions of underground operations, illegal trades, and even darker, more incomprehensible acts. My mind raced with questions and fears. Had Tommy really been alive all these years? Had he been forced into a life of darkness and crime? The idea that someone I once knew, someone I had shared classes and lunches with, could have been dragged into such a terrifying underworld was almost too much to bear. I had to know more. I had to find out what really happened to Tommy Davis. But as I continued to dig deeper, I began to realize that uncovering the truth might lead me down a path I wasn't prepared to walk. A path that could put me and my family in unimaginable danger. After my initial discovery about Tommy Davis on the dark web, I became obsessed with finding out more. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and frantic searches, my mind constantly racing with the need to uncover the truth. The more I read, the more I realized how little I actually knew about what had happened all those years ago. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon another piece of the puzzle. A letter. The article I found claimed that Tommy had left a note for his parents on the day he disappeared. This letter, never publicly disclosed, was said to be a key piece of evidence that the police had kept under wraps. I couldn't believe it. How could such a crucial detail have been hidden for so long? I needed to see this letter for myself. I reached out to one of the users on the forum who claimed to have a copy. After a tense exchange and a small payment in Bitcoin, the user sent me a scanned image of the letter. My hands shook as I opened the file. The letter was handwritten, the familiar loopy script unmistakably Tommy's. It read, "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry for what I'm about to do. I know this will hurt you, and I wish I could explain everything, but I can't. Just know that this is something I have to do. Please don't try to find me. It's better this way. Love, Tommy." The letter was brief, almost cryptic, but it left me with more questions than answers. Did Tommy leave willingly, or was he coerced into writing this? The tone seemed resigned, almost defeated, but it lacked any clear indication of distress. It was impossible to tell if he was acting of his own free will or if someone had forced his hand. I decided to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding Tommy's disappearance. I managed to track down an old news article about the case, which mentioned that his parents had been devastated by his sudden departure. They had cooperated fully with the police, but they too had no idea why Tommy would leave without a word. I reached out to some of my old classmates, hoping to find someone who might remember something useful. Most of them had moved on, their memories of Tommy as hazy as mine had been before this whole ordeal began. But one person stood out, Sarah, who had been one of Tommy's closer friends back then. I managed to get in touch with Sarah, and we arranged to meet at a local coffee shop. She looked almost the same, albeit older and with a few more lines on her face. We exchanged pleasantries, but it didn't take long before we got down to business. "Do you remember Tommy Davis?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes widened and she nodded. "Of course I do. How could I forget? He was one of my best friends." "Do you know anything about the letter he left?" or why he might have left. She sighed, stirring her coffee absently. I remember the letter. His parents were devastated when they found it. We all were. But as for why he left, I honestly don't know. He never mentioned anything about wanting to leave or being unhappy. He just disappeared. I pressed on. Do you think he left willingly? Or do you think someone forced him? Sarah looked troubled. I don't know. Tommy was always a bit of a mystery. He had secrets, things he never talked about. But he never seemed like the type to just run away. If he left, there must have been a good reason. Her words echoed in my mind as I left the coffee shop. There must have been a good reason, but what could possibly compel a 13-year-old boy to leave everything he knew behind? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that finding Tommy might not just be about uncovering the truth. It might be about understanding the darkness that had touched his life and, by extension, mine. After I found Tommy's letter, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something felt wrong. The way it was written, it just didn't sound like the Tommy I knew. It was too cold, too distant. I kept wondering if he really wrote it, or if someone made him write it. I decided to dig deeper. I reached out to a contact on the dark web, someone who knew a lot about documents and handwriting. After some back and forth, I sent them a high-quality scan of the letter. I was nervous while waiting for their response. When it finally came, it hit me like a ton of bricks. It's a forgery, the expert told me. The handwriting looks like Tommy's, but there are small differences in how the letters are formed and the pressure of the pen. Someone tried really hard to make it look like he wrote it. A forgery. That meant someone wanted us to think Tommy left on his own. But why? And who would do that? I went back to the dark web forum where I first found out about Tommy. I searched through old posts trying to find more clues. One username kept popping up, SL100. This person seemed to know a lot about disappearances and fake documents. I sent them a message, hoping they could help me. SL100 replied quickly. They told me about a group that specializes in making people disappear. They use fake letters and documents to cover their tracks. SL100 said this group looks for kids who are smart, but maybe a little lonely. Kids who won't be missed right away. According to them, Tommy was a perfect target. I asked, why would they target someone like Tommy? SL100 said, these groups prey on vulnerable kids. They find those who seem isolated or unhappy, and they lure them in with promises of a better life. This made me think of Tommy's life before he disappeared. He was always a bit quiet, not really fitting in. Maybe that made him an easy target for these people. But I needed more proof. SL100 suggested I look at Tommy's online activity from back then. They said I might find something useful. So I started searching. I went through old social media posts, forums, anywhere Tommy might have left a digital trace. It took hours, but eventually I found something interesting. In an old forum, hidden under years of other posts, I found messages from a user named LonelyTom13. The posts talked about feeling trapped and wanting to escape. It sounded a lot like the letter, but with more emotion, more desperation. Even more interesting were the replies to his posts. Users with strange names offered help and talked about a safe place. One username stood out, Druid2. This person gave detailed advice on how to disappear and start a new life. It felt like Druid2 was part of the group SL100 mentioned. I felt like I was finally getting somewhere, but it also scared me. If Tommy got involved with these people, finding out more could be dangerous. They might not want their secrets exposed, but I couldn't stop now. I needed to know what happened to Tommy. As I dug deeper, I knew I was getting closer to the truth. The forgery of the letter proved someone wanted to cover up what really happened. And now, I was on the trail of the people responsible. It was scary, but I had to keep going. I owed it to Tommy and his family to find out the truth. As I continued my search for the truth about Tommy, I kept thinking about the letter and the messages from Druid 2. It was clear that Tommy didn't leave on his own, and someone went to great lengths to make it look like he did. But who could have helped him, and why? One night, while digging through old school forums and social media posts, I stumbled upon something shocking. A photo from a school event just a week before Tommy disappeared. In the background, I saw Mark, Jack, and Chris talking to Tommy. Those three were always jackasses, bullying and causing trouble. Everyone hated them, but I never thought they would go this far. I decided to dig into their pasts. I started by reaching out to old classmates and friends on social media, asking if they remembered anything about Mark, Jack, and Chris around the time Tommy disappeared. Most responses were vague, but a few people mentioned seeing them act strangely around that time. They were seen whispering in corners, acting secretive. Then I hit a jackpot. One classmate, who asked to remain anonymous, told me about a conversation they overheard. Apparently, Mark, Jack, and Chris had been talking about a big plan involving Tommy. They were laughing about how easy it was going to be. This made my blood boil. Those three had something to do with Tommy going missing, and I needed to find out more. I started to search for any connections they might have had to the dark web or the group SL100 mentioned. It wasn't easy, but after some deep digging, I found out that Jack had been involved in some shady online activities back then. He had been part of forums that discussed hacking and other illegal stuff. It made sense that he could have been the one to forge the letter and help cover up Tommy's disappearance. I confronted Jack first. I found him on social media, living in a different city, and sent him a message. I didn't accuse him outright, but I hinted that I knew about the forgery and their involvement in Tommy's disappearance. His response was defensive and evasive, which only made me more suspicious. Next, I reached out to Mark and Chris. They were harder to track down, but I eventually found them. Mark denied everything and blocked me immediately. Chris, on the other hand, responded. He seemed nervous and kept asking what I knew and how I found out. It was clear he was hiding something. Feeling the pressure, I decided to meet with Sarah again. I needed to tell someone I trusted about what I had found. When we met, I showed her the messages and told her about the evidence pointing to Mark, Jack, and Chris. She was shocked, but not entirely surprised. She remembered how those three had always been troublemakers, but she never thought they could be involved in something so serious. We decided to go to the police with the new evidence. This time, they took us seriously. With the information about the forgery, the shady activities, and the suspicious behavior, they reopened the case. It felt like we were finally getting somewhere. As the investigation progressed, the police found more connections between Mark, Jack, and the group that took Tommy. It turned out they had been in over their heads, thinking it was just some prank or a way to make quick money. They didn't realize the gravity of what they were getting involved in. The deeper we dug, the more disturbing the truth became. It wasn't just about Tommy disappearing, it was about a network of people exploiting vulnerable kids, using them for illegal activities, and making them disappear without a trace. Mark, Jack, and Chris were just pawns in a much larger, darker game. I couldn't believe that people I had once gone to school with had been part of something so horrifying. The evidence was solid, and the police were closing in on the group responsible. It was only a matter of time before the truth about Tommy's disappearance was fully uncovered. So with all the evidence piling up, the police finally arrested Mark, Jack, and Chris. It was a relief seeing those jerks get what they deserved. They had a lot to answer for, and it was clear they were involved in Tommy's disappearance. The whole situation was a mess, but at least those guys were off the streets. Even with their arrest, though, Tommy was still missing. The group he got mixed up with was way more complicated than we thought. It wasn't easy for the police to find every piece of the puzzle. It was frustrating, but at least we knew who was behind it, and that was something. In the middle of all this chaos, something good happened. Sarah and I had been spending a lot of time together, working on finding out what happened to Tommy. We talked a lot, shared our worries, and supported each other. One night, after a long day dealing with the police and new leads, we were sitting in a coffee shop. "Do you remember how we used to hang out after school?" Sarah asked me, smiling a bit. "Yeah, I remember," I said. "I always liked those times." She looked at me with a warm smile and said, "I always thought you liked me back then." I felt my face heat up. "I did. I had a huge crush on you, but I never told you." Sarah reached over and took my hand. "Well, maybe it's not too late." That was the moment things changed for us. We started hanging out even more, and before long we were dating. In the middle of all this darkness, we found something really good. It brought some happiness back into our lives. Looking back, I realized how much everything had changed because of Tommy's disappearance. It brought Sarah and me closer together and reminded us how important it is to stay connected with people we care about. The dark web led me to some scary stuff, but it also helped me find out the truth and reconnect with Sarah. If you're thinking about exploring the dark web, I won't tell you to stay away completely. Just be really careful. It's a place filled with secrets and risks. If you decide to go there, make sure you know what you're doing and stay safe. You never know what you might find or who might be watching. In the end, we might never know exactly what happened to Tommy. But I like to think that wherever he is, he's found some kind of peace. And for those of us still here, we've learned to appreciate the connections we have and never take anything for granted. I've worked at Tech Solutions, Inc. for almost 5 years now. It's a small company, and we're a tight-knit group, which is why it's always puzzled me how our boss, Mr. Harrison, seems to live a life that doesn't quite match up with our modest company's finances. Don't get me wrong, Tech Solutions isn't doing badly. We have a steady stream of clients, and everyone gets paid on time. But Mr. Harrison's lifestyle is on a whole different level. He owns multiple luxury cars, a couple of sprawling mansions, and I've even heard rumors about a yacht. It's the kind of wealth that should come from running a Fortune 500 company, not a small tech firm with barely 20 employees. For a while, I just brushed it off. Maybe he had some family money, or he was really good at investing. But as time went on, the curiosity started eating away at me. It didn't help that I'd heard snippets of conversations about him being secretive and paranoid, always locking his office and being the last to leave the building every night. One day, I decided I needed answers. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was an obsession. I wanted to know how Mr. Harrison could afford such an extravagant lifestyle. But I knew better than to ask him directly. He was a friendly enough guy, but there was always a certain coldness behind his eyes, a sense that he was guarding something. So, I did what any rational person would do, or so I convinced myself. I went on the dark web to hire someone to investigate him. Yeah, I know it sounds extreme, but I felt like it was the only way to get the truth without alerting Mr. Harrison. The dark web always seemed like a myth to me, a place where urban legends were born, but it's real. And it's terrifying. Navigating the dark web is like walking through a maze in pitch darkness. I found a forum that specialized in private investigations, and after a lot of back and forth and gut-wrenching paranoia, I managed to contact someone who seemed legitimate. His username was Shadehunter, and his profile was filled with positive reviews from other users. I felt a mix of relief and dread when he agreed to take on the job. The process of hiring him was surprisingly straightforward, yet chillingly impersonal. I sent him the basic details about Mr. Harrison, his full name, the company name, and a brief description of his lifestyle. Shadehunter assured me that he had methods to dig deep, deeper than any conventional investigator could. His fee was steep, but I paid it without hesitation, transferring the cryptocurrency through a series of anonymized transactions that made my head spin. For days, I heard nothing. Every time I saw Mr. Harrison at the office, my heart would race. Did he know? Could he somehow sense what I was doing? It was nerve-wracking. I started noticing things that I had never paid attention to before. The way he always glanced over his shoulder, how his office door was always locked when he wasn't around, and the way he seemed to avoid certain topics in conversations. Then one night I received an encrypted message from Shadehunter. My heart pounded as I read it. He had found something big. He needed more time to dig deeper, but what he had discovered so far was already disturbing. He mentioned offshore accounts, connections to unsavory characters, and hinted at activities that were definitely illegal. The message ended with a warning. Be careful, you have no idea what you're getting into. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced with possibilities and fears. What had I uncovered? What kind of man was Mr. Harrison really? And more importantly, what would happen if he found out I was investigating him? The next morning I went to work as usual, trying to act normal. But everything felt different. The office, the people, even Mr. Harrison's seemingly friendly smile. It all seemed tainted with a hidden darkness that I couldn't unsee. I had started down a path I couldn't turn back from, and deep down, I knew the real horror was just beginning. A week passed, and the dread in my stomach only grew heavier. I'd jump every time my phone buzzed, half expecting it to be another message from Shadehunter or, worse, some kind of threat from Mr. Harrison himself. Then, late one night, just as I was about to give up hope of hearing anything more, I received an encrypted email from Shadehunter. It was simply titled, Proof. My hand shook as I opened the email. Inside was a link to a secure drop site. I followed it and downloaded a series of files. What I found was more than I ever expected. The first file was a collection of screenshots. They showed Mr. Harrison's personal computer screen, filled with transactions on various dark web marketplaces. He was buying and selling, well, everything. It was like a catalog of illegal activities. Each screenshot was time-stamped, and there were hundreds of them, dating back years. This was no small-time operation. It was a vast, well-oiled machine. Next, there were several video recordings. They showed Mr. Harrison in what appeared to be a secure, dimly lit room, negotiating deals with men in black suits, whose faces were obscured. The audio was clear enough to hear their conversations. They discussed shipments, payments, and the occasional problem that needed taking care of. It was chilling to see my boss, the man who smiled and joked at the office, so cold and calculating in these videos. The last file was a spreadsheet detailing offshore accounts. There were dozens of them, each with staggering amounts of money. The funds were constantly moving, being transferred from one account to another, probably laundering the dirty money from his illegal activities. It was a masterclass in financial deception. I stared at the screen, unable to process the enormity of what I was seeing. Mr. Harrison wasn't just living a double life. He was a kingpin of some dark web empire. My blood ran cold as I realized the extent of his operations and the danger I was in just knowing about it. Shadehunter had included a final note. This is just the surface. There's more, but it's risky. Do you want me to continue? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to back out, to pretend I never saw any of this. But another part of me, the part that had started this whole thing, needed to see it through. I needed to know the full truth, no matter how terrifying it was. I replied to Shadehunter, telling him to continue. I also started backing up all the files he sent me, encrypting them and storing them in multiple places. If anything happened to me, I wanted someone to find them, to know what Mr. Harrison was really up to. Going to work the next day was torture. I couldn't look at Mr. Harrison the same way. Every time he walked past my desk, I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact, but I could feel his eyes on me, like he knew something was up. It was only a matter of time before he found out what I was doing. The days dragged on, each one more stressful than the last. I was living a double life myself now, pretending everything was normal, while knowing the horrific truth. And all the while I waited for the next message from Shadehunter, knowing it would bring me deeper into the darkness. Another week crawled by, each day more suffocating than the last. I hadn't heard from Shadehunter, and the silence gnawed at me. Had something happened to him? Or worse, was Mr. Harrison onto us? Late one night, as I was about to shut down my computer, a new message from Shadehunter appeared in my inbox. The subject line was stark. Urgent. We need to stop. My pulse quickened as I opened the email. It was shorter than his previous messages, but the content sent chills down my spine. I've uncovered more details about Mr. Harrison's connections. He's involved with some very dangerous people you don't want to mess with. These aren't just business associates. They're criminals with a history of making problems disappear. Some of them have ties to organized crime, others to powerful political figures. They're not just on the dark web, they're everywhere. I've already been warned off by some of my own contacts. This isn't just about Mr. Harrison anymore. It's about you and me. If we keep digging, they'll find out, and when they do, we'll both be in serious trouble. For your safety and mine, we need to stop this investigation immediately. Destroy the files I sent you and act like none of this ever happened. This is your only warning. Be smart. Stay safe. My stomach dropped. The investigator's words hung heavy in the air, confirming my worst fears. Mr. Harrison wasn't just a shady businessman. He was entwined with a network of people who could easily ruin lives or end them. I sat there staring at the screen, paralyzed by indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to follow Shadehunter's advice, to erase everything and move on. But another part of me, the stubborn, curious part, wanted justice. Could I really just walk away now, knowing what I knew? The next day at work was unbearable. Every time Mr. Harrison walked by, I felt a surge of panic. Did he know I was onto him? Was he already planning to get rid of me? Paranoia wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. During lunch, I slipped away to a secluded park near the office. I needed to think. Shadehunter's warning replayed in my mind. These were people who could erase us without a second thought. Was I willing to risk my life for this? For answers that might never see the light of day? My phone buzzed. Another message from Shadehunter. Remember, this isn't a game. These people are dangerous. Destroy the files. Stay safe. The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I had no idea what I was up against. These weren't just faceless people who are just your normal people on the dark web. They were real, powerful, and ruthless. With a heavy heart, I went home and followed Shadehunter's instructions. I deleted the files, wiped my computer clean, and encrypted my remaining backups so deeply that even I would struggle to access them. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with those men dressed in black suits and the cold, calculating eyes of Mr. Harrison. I woke up in a cold sweat, more determined than ever to tread carefully. I resolved to act normal, to blend back into the background. Maybe if I was lucky, Mr. Harrison wouldn't suspect a thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every move I made was under scrutiny. From that point on, I kept my head down at work, focusing on my tasks and avoiding unnecessary interactions. But the fear never left me. I had poked a hornet's nest, and now I had to pray I wouldn't get stung. Determined to heed Shadehunter's advice, I made a conscious decision to forget everything I had uncovered about Mr. Harrison and his dark web empire. My survival depended on blending in, on becoming invisible. I had to act like I knew nothing, like I was just another employee focused solely on my job. The next morning, I walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. I greeted my colleagues with a smile, participated in small talk, and threw myself into my tasks with a fervor that surprised even me. I couldn't afford to let my fear show. I had to be the picture of normalcy. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of work began to feel like a refuge. I buried myself in projects, took on extra responsibilities, and even volunteered for overtime. The more I immersed myself in work, the easier it became to push the unsettling knowledge of Mr. Harrison's double life to the back of my mind. Mr. Harrison, for his part, seemed completely unaware of my previous snooping. He continued to be the same charismatic, if slightly distant boss he had always been. He praised my increased productivity, even mentioned the possibility of a promotion during one of our meetings. Every time he smiled at me, a chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to smile back, to act grateful and eager. I started spending my lunch breaks with my co-workers, joining them for coffee runs and office gossip. It helped to anchor me in the present, to remind me that I was just another employee at Tech Solutions. I laughed at their jokes, shared stories, and made a conscious effort to be more social. The camaraderie was a welcome distraction from the underlying tension that still gnawed at me. At home, I developed a routine to keep myself grounded. I took up jogging, started cooking elaborate meals, and even picked up a few new hobbies. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to prevent it from wandering back to the dark secrets I had uncovered. I stopped checking my email obsessively, and I deleted the encrypted backups, determined to leave no trace of my ill-fated investigation. The more time passed, the more confident I became that I had successfully buried my knowledge. I began to relax, to breathe a little easier. Maybe I had managed to slip under the radar. Maybe, just maybe, I could move on from this without consequence. Then, one evening, as I was leaving the office, Mr. Harrison called me into his office. My heart raced as I walked down the hallway, but I forced myself to stay calm. Inside, he congratulated me on my hard work and dedication. He even handed me a bonus check, a gesture that felt both rewarding and ominous. "Keep up the good work," he said with that familiar smile, his eyes briefly locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something behind his gaze, something knowing. But it passed quickly, and I was left wondering if it was just my imagination. I thanked him, pocketed the check, and walked out of his office with a mixture of relief and unease. Had he really bought my act? Or was he just playing along, waiting for the right moment to strike? The uncertainty was maddening, but I had no choice but to continue the charade. I had to keep up the facade, to act like the diligent, unsuspecting employee. My life depended on it. As I drove home that night, I was thinking if I should leave the company. The day finally came when I decided I couldn't stay at Tech Solutions any longer. The constant stress and paranoia were eating away at me, and I needed a fresh start. With a rehearsed speech in mind, I approached Mr. Harrison's office, my heart pounding. "Mr. Harrison, can I speak with you for a moment?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course, come in," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I took a deep breath and began. "I've decided to resign from Tech Solutions. I've found a better paying job, and it's an opportunity I can't pass up." Mr. Harrison's expression shifted to one of surprise and concern. "You're one of my best workers here. I can't afford to lose you. What would it take for you to stay? I hadn't expected this. It's really about the salary, Mr. Harrison. I need to secure my future." He leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "I understand. How about I match their offer? I'll even throw in a little extra. You've been invaluable to this company, and I don't want to lose you." I was stunned. Part of me wanted to escape, to leave all the dark secrets behind, but the offer was too good to ignore. More money meant more security, more comfort. Yet, the fear lingered. Was this a genuine offer? Or was he trying to keep me close, to keep an eye on me? I swallowed hard and nodded. "That's very generous, Mr. Harrison. I'll stay." He smiled warmly, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite read. "I'm glad to hear that. Let's discuss the details and make sure you're happy here." As I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a golden cage. The higher salary was enticing, but the underlying tension, the unspoken threat, remained. Had he seen through my act all along? Was this his way of keeping me under control, ensuring I wouldn't expose his secrets? And now, Reddit, I'm stuck. Do you think he knows what I did? Is he trying to keep me here to keep an eye on me? Or am I just overthinking this? Every day I walk a tightrope pretending everything is fine while wondering if Mr. Harrison's smile hides a sinister knowledge. What should I do? And yes, I think you already know, but I still want to say it. The company name, my boss name, and every name that is mentioned in the story is changed for my own safety. And please answer the questions I asked. Do you guys think that he knows? Hey Reddit, I've got a story that's been haunting me and I think it's finally time to share it. It all started as a joke, one of those, wouldn't it be funny if, kind of ideas that spiraled way out of control. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of eyes watching me, even when I'm alone. So this happened about 6 months ago. My friends and I were deep in one of our typical Friday night hangouts, swapping urban legends and creeping each other out with tales from the dark corners of the internet. We'd had a few beers and someone mentioned the dark web, you know, that shadowy part of the internet where you can supposedly find anything. My buddy Chris dared me to find the creepiest service I could and actually use it. Naturally, with liquid courage in my system, I took the dare. After a bit of fumbling around, and with some questionable guidance from Chris, I managed to get onto the dark web. We were all laughing and joking as I scrolled through various sites, each more bizarre and disturbing than the last. That's when I stumbled upon a service that claimed to provide professional stalking. The description was chillingly vague. They promised to deliver an authentic stalking experience that would leave you questioning your own safety. In our inebriated state, this sounded like the ultimate prank. I mean, who would actually want to be stalked, right? It was just too absurd to pass up. So I clicked on the link, filled out the form with fake details, John Doe, 123 Fake Street, you get the idea, and even used a throwaway email. The last step was a payment, 0.01 Bitcoin. Back then, it was about $80, but it felt like a fair price for a good laugh. With Chris egging me on, I hit send. A week passed and the joke had pretty much faded from our minds. That is, until I started noticing strange things. It was subtle at first. My trash cans were always knocked over, even though I never saw any animals around. Then, I found footprints in the mud under my bedroom window. They were big, bigger than any of my friends' shoes. I told myself it was just a coincidence. After all, I hadn't given any real information. Then one night, around 2 a.m., I got an email from the throwaway account I'd used. The subject line simply read, "I see you." Inside, there was a photo attached. It was a picture of my house, taken from the edge of my driveway. I felt my stomach drop. It was impossible. I had given fake information, yet here was undeniable proof that someone knew where I lived. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank by Chris or one of my other friends, but they all swore they had nothing to do with it. They even seemed genuinely freaked out when I showed them the email. The next night, I decided to stay up and keep watch. I didn't tell anyone about this plan, thinking I'd catch whoever it was and end the madness. Around midnight, I saw movement at the edge of my yard. A dark figure, tall and lean, was standing there, just watching my house. I felt a chill run down my spine. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to call the police, but I was paralyzed with fear. The figure stayed there for what felt like hours before slowly turning and disappearing into the night. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I found another email in my inbox. This one had multiple photos, shots of me at work, at the grocery store, even leaving my friend's house. The timestamps on the photos showed they were taken over the past week. I had never felt so violated in my life. In a panic, I contacted the site where I had hired the stalker. I begged them to stop, explained that it was a joke gone wrong. The response was immediate and terrifyingly simple. There are no refunds. I was trapped in my own nightmare. Someone was out there watching my every move and there was nothing I could do about it. I couldn't go to the police without admitting I had hired this lunatic. My friends couldn't help me, and my family would never understand. So here I am, reaching out to you, Reddit. Has anyone else experienced something like this? How do I make it stop? And most importantly, who the hell is stalking me? Hey Reddit, thanks for all the support and suggestions after my first post. I wish I could say things got better, but they didn't. If anything, they got worse. Much worse. After that second email, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every shadow seemed sinister, every sound a potential threat. I started taking different routes to work, switching up my schedule, hoping to shake off whoever was following me. But no matter what I did, the emails kept coming, each one more invasive than the last. One particularly disturbing email had a photo of me sleeping. The thought of someone sneaking into my house, standing over me while I slept, made my skin crawl. I changed all the locks, installed security cameras, and even got a dog for extra security. Nothing deterred the stalker. One night, as I was reviewing footage from my newly installed cameras, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around 3 a.m., a figure appeared on the edge of the camera's range. They stood there for a few minutes, then moved closer, coming into full view. The person was wearing a dark hoodie, face obscured, but they had a peculiar, deliberate way of moving. They circled my house, stopping occasionally to look directly at the camera, almost as if they were taunting me. I took the footage to the police, finally deciding that my fear of admitting my involvement in hiring the stalker was less important than my safety. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but didn't seem to take it very seriously. He suggested it might be a prank and advised me to stay vigilant. They promised to increase patrols in my area, but it did little to ease my anxiety. Then came the night that pushed me over the edge. I was awoken by the sound of breaking glass. My heart pounded as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept downstairs. The living room window was shattered, and a cold breeze filled the room. I felt a presence behind me before I heard the voice. "Nice bat. Think it'll save you?" I spun around, but the room was empty. The voice had come from the darkness, a whisper that seemed to wrap around me. I fumbled for the light switch, but when the room flooded with light, there was no one there. Just the broken window and a note taped to the wall. It read, "You can't hide from me." I was done playing games. I packed a bag and left that night, driving to a friend's house several towns over. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my friend. I crashed on their couch, too exhausted to explain the full story. The next morning, I woke up to find another email waiting for me. The subject line, "Missed you last night." The email contained a single photo, my friend's house, taken from the driveway. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, hadn't posted anything online, yet the stalker had found me. Desperation set in. I contacted a private investigator, explained the entire situation, and hired them to help me. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Laura, took my case seriously from the start. She promised to get to the bottom of it and assured me that everyone leaves a trail. Days turned into weeks, and Laura's updates were my only source of hope. She found out that the dark website I had used was linked to a notorious group known for exploiting people's fears. The group's members were experts at gathering information from the smallest crumbs left online. A tagged photo, a careless comment, a seemingly innocent post. They had somehow pieced together my real identity from the fake details I had provided. Laura warned me that this group was dangerous and that their services were often more about psychological torment than anything else. She advised me to stay in public places, never be alone, and keep my loved ones informed and safe. Despite the precautions, the emails continued. Now they were less frequent but more personal, filled with details about my life that no one should know. My childhood nickname, my favorite teacher, even the name of my first pet. The stalker was digging deep, trying to break me down. Hey Reddit, thanks for sticking with me through this ordeal. It's been a terrifying journey, but I'm finally at a point where I can share how this nightmare ended. I appreciate all the advice and support you guys gave. It really helped keep me sane. After weeks of living in constant fear, Laura, the private investigator, made a breakthrough. She managed to trace some of the emails back to a remote server farm in Eastern Europe. It was a dead end in terms of finding the individual responsible, but it confirmed that this wasn't just a local prank. This was a coordinated effort by a group of skilled cyberstalkers. One night I got a call from Laura. She sounded more serious than usual. She had been working with some contacts in cybersecurity and they had a plan. It was risky, but it might be the only way to stop the stalker. They wanted to set a trap, using me as bait. I was terrified, but I agreed. I was beyond the point of being scared. I just wanted my life back. Laura and her team set up a fake trail, making it look like I had fled to a remote cabin in the woods. They leaked this information through various channels, ensuring the stalker would find it. I was stationed in a safe house, surrounded by Laura's team and local law enforcement, all monitoring the situation closely. As expected, the stalker took the bait. We watched through hidden cameras as a figure approached the cabin. It was the same person from the earlier footage, tall, hooded, and eerily methodical. The stalker broke into the cabin, only to be met with an empty space and a barrage of flashing lights as Laura's team moved in. They managed to apprehend the person, who turned out to be a member of the cyberstalking group. They were a middle-aged man, unassuming and seemingly ordinary, a stark contrast to the terror they had inflicted. Under questioning, he revealed the extent of their operation. They targeted people who engaged with their dark web services, exploiting any information they could find to create a facade of omnipresence. It wasn't just me. There were dozens of victims, all living in fear, just like I had been. With the stalker in custody, the group's network started to unravel. Authorities managed to track down several other members, and their operation was dismantled. It was a relief, but it also brought a heavy realization. There are many such groups out there, preying on the vulnerable and the curious. Returning to my normal life was hard. The fear didn't just vanish overnight. I had to rebuild my sense of security, brick by brick. I took steps to secure my digital presence, ensuring that my personal information was locked down tight. Therapy helped too, allowing me to process the trauma and move forward. I learned some hard lessons through all this. The internet, for all its wonders, has dark corners that are best left unexplored. Pranks and dares, especially involving something as dangerous as hiring a stalker, can have real, terrifying consequences. And most importantly, the importance of cybersecurity and personal privacy can't be overstated. If you take anything away from my story, let it be this: be cautious, be aware, and never underestimate the lengths some people will go to invade your life. Thanks for listening, Reddit. Stay safe out there.